What would you do if you came back to your cabin and found a stranger living inside, claiming it now belonged to him because his mother, the HOA president, said so? Devin Matthews had driven 4 hours straight, hands tight on the wheel, with nothing on his mind but the lake. His cabin? His sanctuary. He'd been away for 2 weeks finishing a construction job in Birmingham, and he swore he could already feel the peace washing over him as he turned onto the winding road that hugged the shoreline. That cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was proof that decades of sweat, early mornings, and long nights meant something. It was the reward he had promised himself. But as he pulled into the gravel driveway, his foot froze on the brake. His front door was wide open, a rocking chair he'd bought second-hand, now swaying on the porch. And then he saw him. A man, mid-30s, cocky grin, shoes kicked up, lounging back in Devin's chair as if it had been his all along. Devin cut the engine, slammed the door, and stormed up the steps. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, voice rough, already bracing for an explanation that wouldn't make sense. The man barely shifted, lifting a beer to his lips before answering. "Name's Brandon. Brandon Whitfield. My mom runs the HOA, so this place? It's mine now." Devin's stomach flipped. "Yours? That's impossible. I bought this cabin outright, paid cash, got the deed locked in my truck right now. You think you can just sit here and relax?" Brandon interrupted, spreading his arms as though he owned the whole lake. "Paperwork got sorted. HOA says there was a mistake with the transfer. My mom signed off and now I'm the rightful owner. You're trespassing." Trespassing. Devin's throat tightened around the word. He pushed past Brandon, stormed inside, and nearly collapsed. Boxes, his boxes, were stacked like leftovers, taped up and labeled in someone else's handwriting. His clothes, his tools, his photographs, shoved aside as if his life could be packed up and tossed out in an afternoon. Devin grabbed one of the boxes and ripped it open, pulling out a framed picture of his parents standing with him when he'd signed the closing documents months earlier. "You had no right," he said, his voice shaking. "This is my home. You don't just throw someone out because your mother thinks she can shuffle papers." Brandon rose slowly, stepping closer with a smirk that made Devin's blood boil. "Look, man, don't make this ugly. My mom runs things around here. Everyone knows it. If she says this cabin's mine, then it's mine. End of story." The arrogance in his tone was louder than his words. Devin could practically hear the years of entitlement dripping from each syllable. He clenched his fists, but forced himself not to swing. One bad move, and they'd paint him as the angry outsider. He turned on his heel, stormed back to his truck, and yanked out the deed. The paper was wrinkled from being folded and unfolded too many times, but the words were clear. Devin Matthews, owner. He marched back to the porch and shoved it at Brandon. "Read it. Tell me what that says. Tell me who this cabin belongs to." Brandon didn't even look. He just laughed. "Deeds don't mean much when the HOA says otherwise. My mom already filed everything. You're done here." Devin's jaw locked so hard it hurt. For a second, all he could hear was his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. He'd worked too long, sacrificed too much, to be erased with a signature from a woman who thought her authority stretched farther than the law. Behind Brandon, the rocking chair creaked. The sound cut through Devin's thoughts like a blade, reminding him that this wasn't just a house. It was his peace, his retreat from the chaos of construction sites and city traffic, and debts he had finally crawled out from under. And now it was being stolen, right in front of him, by people who hadn't lifted a finger to earn it. Devin didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stepped down off the porch, deed in hand, and looked out over the lake. The water shimmered under the late afternoon sun, calm and unmoved by the storm building in his chest. He whispered to himself, almost too quiet for Brandon to hear, "This isn't over." But Devin wasn't the type to make empty threats. He already knew what he had to do. He just needed time and a plan. But what Devin didn't realize was that the battle ahead wouldn't just be about a cabin. It would be about exposing how far the HOA would go to crush anyone who stood in their way. Long before Devin Matthews ever laid eyes on that cabin by the lake, his life had been about sacrifice. He wasn't born into money, and he sure wasn't handed opportunities. He built them brick by brick, job by job. For over 20 years, Devin had worked as a contractor, hauling lumber, installing drywall, crawling under houses, and sweating on rooftops through the hottest Alabama summers. His hands carried scars that told the story better than words ever could. Every paycheck, after bills and child support, after gas for the truck and tools he couldn't do without, he tucked away whatever scraps were left. Sometimes it was a couple $100, sometimes just 50. His friends teased him for living so lean, eating frozen meals, driving an old Ford that rattled every time it hit a pothole. But Devin didn't mind. He had one vision that kept him moving: owning a piece of land that was his and his alone. For years he rented cheap apartments in Montgomery and Mobile, bouncing around when landlords sold buildings or hiked rents. There was never stability, never a sense of permanence. He told himself that one day he'd wake up in a place where nobody could tell him to leave. That dream became his obsession. It finally took shape when a buddy at work mentioned a listing he'd seen for a small lake cabin outside Talladega. The place was simple, nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a porch that needed fixing, and a dock half rotted into the water. But when Devin drove out to see it, his chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt before. The cabin sat on a quiet stretch of land surrounded by tall pines, the water glinting just a stone's throw from the front steps. It wasn't big, and it wasn't polished, but it was real. And it was his shot. The asking price was steep for a man like Devin, but he had cash saved, and for the first time in his life, the numbers added up. He closed the deal within a month. The day he signed the papers, he drove straight to the cabin, leaned against the railing of that shaky porch, and just breathed. For the first time in decades, he wasn't renting. He wasn't borrowing. He wasn't hustling for someone else's dream. This was his. He called his sister Denise that evening. She lived in Jackson, raising 2 kids on her own. "You finally did it," she told him, pride heavy in her voice. "I can't believe my brother owns lakefront property. Mom and Dad would be smiling down on you. They'd be laughing at how much work this place needs," Devin said, chuckling. "But I don't care. It's mine. Every nail, every board. It's mine." That was the magic of it. Devin didn't care that the roof leaked or the plumbing rattled. He didn't care that the neighbors gave him long looks when he first pulled up in his work truck. He was too busy fixing boards, sanding down old furniture, and teaching himself how to repair the dock. Every weekend, he chipped away at it, transforming the cabin piece by piece. And yet, in the back of his mind, there was always the HOA. From the very first week, Devin had gotten letters, tiny nitpicks over things that didn't matter. "Your truck is parked too close to the road. Your grass exceeds the length allowed by community standards. Your dock construction needs to be reviewed by the HOA before continuing." He rolled his eyes, gritted his teeth, and complied where he had to. But he noticed something strange. Not everyone got those letters. Neighbors with boats parked half on the grass? No problem. Brandon Whitfield throwing loud parties 2 cabins down? No letters. But Devin, the newcomer, the man who worked 12-hour days and barely had time to sit on his porch? They made sure he got notices for everything. He tried to shrug it off, reminding himself it was worth it. On Friday nights, after work, he'd drive up with a cooler in the back seat, open the cabin windows, and listen to the crickets sing while he grilled chicken on a rusted barbecue. He'd stare out at the lake and think, "I finally have a home where no one can take this from me." That thought gave him peace, until the day he returned and found Brandon in his chair. But while Devin saw the cabin as the reward for a lifetime of sacrifice, the HOA saw it as nothing more than a piece on their chessboard, and they had no intention of letting him keep it without a fight. If you asked anyone in the lakeside community who ran things, they wouldn't point to the town council or the county clerk. They'd point to one woman, Karen Whitfield, president of the Lakewood Homeowners Association. Karen wasn't elected because she was kind or fair. She was elected because she was relentless. She thrived on control, and she knew how to bend rules to suit her. Over the years, neighbors had learned it was easier to nod along with her than to push back. Anyone who tried found themselves drowning in letters, fines, or worse. Rumors that spread faster than fire in dry grass. She lived 3 doors down from Devin's cabin, in the biggest house on the lake. White siding, a fresh coat of paint every summer, manicured hedges trimmed to perfection. To Karen, her home was a castle, and the HOA was her crown. She carried herself with the certainty that her word was law, even when it wasn't. The first time Devin met her, she introduced herself as if he should already know who she was. "I'm Karen Whitfield, president of the HOA. If you need anything, I'm the one you talk to," she said, smiling thinly as her eyes scanned his old truck, then his work boots, then the patched-up jeans he wore without shame. "Appreciate it," Devin replied, polite but guarded. He'd been around enough controlling people on job sites to know what kind of personality he was dealing with. It didn't take long for him to see her influence in action. At barbecues by the water, people lowered their voices when Karen walked by. At HOA meetings in the community center, she spoke more than anyone else, tossing around terms like bylaws and standards as if she had written them herself. And in a way, she had. "She's been in charge for 12 years, a neighbor, Mrs. Green, whispered to Devin one evening as they folded chairs after a meeting. "Runs this place like her own little kingdom. If you're in her circle, you're fine. If not, good luck." Devin chuckled nervously, unsure if she was exaggerating. But the next week, he got another letter taped to his door. This one claimed his dock work compromised community safety standards. The irony wasn't lost on him. Half the docks on the lake leaned like drunk men, but none of those owners had letters slapped on their doors. It was always Devin. He tried addressing it calmly. One Saturday, after catching Karen on her morning walk, he brought it up. "Ma'am, I keep getting these notices about my cabin, but I see plenty of folks doing the same things without a problem. What gives?" Karen smiled, but her eyes stayed cold. "Devin, I'm just enforcing the rules. If others are out of line, I'll deal with them when the time comes. Until then, I expect you to follow the bylaws like everyone else." "Everyone else?" Devin pressed. "Or just me?" Her smile widened, sharp as glass. "Don't make this personal." The words stuck with him, because from where he stood, it already was. Neighbors told stories in hushed tones about how Karen had blocked fence permits, rejected paint colors, even forced a family to tear down a deck after it was already built. Yet her son Brandon? He could get away with anything. His lawn grew wild for weeks, his parties lasted until sunrise, his friends parked wherever they pleased. No letters, no fines, nothing. The favoritism wasn't even subtle. Brandon strutted through the neighborhood like a prince, waving off complaints because he knew his mother had his back. More than once, Devin overheard him bragging, "HOA doesn't touch me. I've got immunity." It made Devin's blood boil, but he bit his tongue. He told himself he wasn't there to pick fights. He was there to enjoy his cabin, fix it up, and carve out a piece of peace for himself. He ignored the petty notices, filed them in a drawer, and went on with his work. Still, a question nagged at him. What happens when Karen decides peace isn't enough for her? That answer came the day he found Brandon sitting on his porch. By then, Devin realized Karen wasn't just meddling, she was orchestrating something bigger. She had the power, the influence, and the arrogance to believe she could take what wasn't hers and get away with it. But what she didn't count on was Devin being the kind of man who documented everything, the kind of man who wouldn't just roll over when someone tried to erase him from his own land. Devin always kept his paperwork close. He wasn't reckless with documents, not after years of dealing with subcontractors, city permits, and clients who tried to wriggle out of paying him. He knew better than most how important a signature could be. That's why, when he bought the cabin, he made copies of everything: deed, closing papers, tax receipts, and stored them in a heavy-duty folder in his truck. So when Brandon tossed out the word trespassing, Devin's mind immediately shifted to defense. He drove straight into town the next morning, stopping at the county records office. The clerk, a young guy named Sean, who couldn't have been older than 25, pulled up the property file on his computer. "Here it is," Sean said, turning the monitor slightly. Devin leaned in. His name was there. Owner, Devin Matthews. Relief washed over him, but only for a second. because right underneath, a new document appeared, a transfer notice, dated just last week, and signed by none other than Karen Whitfield. Devin's jaw clenched. How is that even possible? I never signed anything. Nobody asked me for permission, Sean frowned. It looks like there was a correction filed. Claims the original deed had errors, and that the property should have been under the Whitfield name. These things happen sometimes with clerical mistakes. Usually it gets cleared up, but... But what? Devin pressed. Sean hesitated, lowering his voice. Well, most people don't have the HOA president pushing paperwork for them. Mrs. Whitfield. She's got influence. Stuff gets processed faster when her name's on it. Devin stared at the screen, the room suddenly feeling too small. He'd worked half his life for that cabin, and here it was, snatched away with the stroke of a pen. Later that afternoon, he confronted Karen directly. She was pruning flowers in her front yard, wearing oversized sunglasses and a sun hat that looked more suited for a country club than a lake community. You want to tell me why my deed's got your signature on it? Devin asked, his voice steady, but tight. Karen didn't flinch. Oh, Devin, I figured you'd find out eventually. It's nothing personal, just paperwork. Turns out the original filing had mistakes. My son was the rightful recipient, so we corrected it, that's all. Rightful recipient? Devin barked out a laugh, though nothing about it felt funny. Lady, I bought that cabin. I paid every cent. No bank, no loan. That's mine. Karen tilted her head, lips curling into a polite smile. I'm afraid the records don't say that anymore. That's fraud. Devin shot back. You can't just sign off on property that doesn't belong to you. Be careful with your words, Karen warned, her voice low. Accusing someone of fraud is serious, especially someone like me. I have a lot of friends in this community, Devin. People who respect what I've built here. You don't want to make this ugly. Devin stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. You already made it ugly when you broke into my home and threw my life into boxes. For a moment, the mask slipped. Karen's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing. But then she waved her hand dismissively, turning back to her flowers. If you feel strongly, go hire a lawyer. Until then, Brandon has every right to stay. I'd suggest you avoid causing a scene. The arrogance in her tone dug deep into Devin's chest. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about power. She was daring him to fight, daring him to step out of line so she could call the cops and paint him as the problem. That night, Devin sat on the tailgate of his truck, staring out at the lake. The sound of laughter carried across the water, Brandon throwing another party at what used to be Devin's cabin. Music blared, bottles clinked, voices shouted. Each noise was a reminder of what had been stolen from him. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister. Any luck? He typed back. They faked paperwork. HOA president signed it over to her son. A pause. Then Denise replied, You're kidding me. That's criminal. You're not letting them win, are you? Devin stared at the screen, his jaw tight. Not a chance. He knew then that this wasn't going to be solved with polite conversations or hoping the system would suddenly turn fair. If Karen could twist paperwork, she could twist perception too. She'd tell the neighbors he was dangerous, that he didn't belong, that he was stirring trouble. And people might believe her, because for years they always had. But Devin wasn't the same as her past victims. He'd spent decades fighting uphill battles. He knew how to build, how to strategize, and most of all, how to document every dirty trick someone tried to pull. But while Karen thought a signature could erase him, Devin was already piecing together a plan that would make the whole community see who the real fraud was. The tension finally snapped on a Sunday morning. Devin had spent the night in his truck, parked just outside the cabin, unwilling to drive back to the city and leave his property in Brandon's hands. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders sore from trying to sleep upright. But when he stepped out to stretch, the sight in front of him lit a fire he couldn't ignore. Brandon was sitting shirtless on the porch, drinking coffee from Devin's favorite mug. A mug Devin's daughter had painted for him when she was 6. Blue paint smeared with shaky brush strokes spelling out, Dad's Cabin. Seeing it in Brandon's hand was like a punch to the gut. Put that down, Devin snapped, storming up the steps. Brandon leaned back in the rocking chair, grinning. What's wrong? Little attached to your coffee cup? That's not just a cup. That's mine. This whole place is mine. Devin's voice was shaking now, the exhaustion mixing with rage. Not according to the records, Brandon said, smug as ever. You're wasting your breath. Mom fixed everything. You're squatting, Matthews. Get used to it. Devin stepped closer, close enough to smell the whiskey laced in Brandon's morning coffee. You don't know me. I don't quit. You think you can erase me with your mom's signature? I'll take this to the county, to the state. I'll fight you every way there is. Brandon set the mug down on the railing and stood, chest puffed. You really think anyone's gonna side with you over my mom? She's been running this lake longer than you've even been here. People trust her. You? You're just the contractor who thought he could buy his way into the neighborhood. Devin's fists clenched so hard his knuckles whitened, but before he could respond, a voice cut across the yard. What's going on here? Karen appeared at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She looked like she'd been expecting the confrontation, like she'd timed her arrival perfectly. Devin turned toward her, his voice loud and sharp. What's going on is your son living in a house that doesn't belong to him. You faked paperwork, boxed up my life, and now you're letting him drink from a mug my little girl made me. How do you justify that? Karen's lips curled into that same thin smile. Oh, Devin, no one faked anything. We corrected an error. The association decided it was in the community's best interest for Brandon to take ownership. Community's best interest? Devin repeated, his laugh bitter. You mean your best interest? You mean you pulled strings because you thought I wouldn't fight back? Brandon stepped between them, cocky as ever. Face it, man. You lost. Walk away before you embarrass yourself even more. Devin's eyes darted from Brandon to Karen. He could feel the weight of the fight pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. But deep down, something else was forming. A stubborn flame. The same one that had carried him through years of hard labor when quitting would have been easier. You don't get to tell me when I've lost, he said firmly. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen tilted her head, her voice sugar-coated but sharp as glass. Be careful, Devin. Anger doesn't look good on you. The more you lash out, the more this community will see who the real problem is. Devin took a slow step back, forcing himself to breathe. She was baiting him. She wanted him to explode so she could run to the sheriff and spin the story. But he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, he turned and walked to his truck, climbed onto the tailgate, and sat down. His heart was pounding, his hands still trembling, but he kept his eyes on them. He wanted them to know he wasn't leaving. Not today. Not tomorrow. Karen adjusted her sunglasses, gave her son a look, and the two of them retreated into the cabin. From inside, Devin could hear Brandon's laughter echoing off the walls. He stayed there until the sun dipped low, the lake reflecting streaks of orange and pink. His sister called, worried again, but Devin told her the same thing he whispered to himself. I'm not backing down. Because in that moment, sitting outside the home that had been stolen from him, he realized this wasn't just about property. It was about dignity. It was about not letting someone with power and arrogance trample over years of sacrifice. But if Devin wanted to win, he knew brute force wasn't the answer. He needed a plan sharp enough to cut through every trick Karen had ever pulled. The fight had reached a boiling point, but Devin knew he couldn't go head-to-head with the Whitfields in broad daylight. They wanted that. They wanted him angry, shouting, making a scene, so they could paint him as unstable and dangerous. That was their playbook, and he wasn't about to step into their trap. Instead, Devin decided to do what he did best. Work with his hands, keep his head down, and build something that would last. But this time, it wasn't a deck or a kitchen remodel. It was a case. A case so airtight that when he finally struck back, no amount of HOA spin would bury it. The first step was documentation. He started snapping pictures of his deed, of the boxes shoved onto his porch, of Brandon's parties spilling into his yard. Every notice Karen had ever taped to his door, he laid them out and took photos, time-stamped and backed up on 2 different drives. If this thing went legal, he wasn't walking in with accusations. He was walking in with proof. Late one night, he sat in his truck with a notepad, scribbling names of neighbors who had hinted at frustrations with Karen. Mrs. Green, the older woman who whispered warnings after meetings. The Harris family, who had once been forced to repaint their entire home because Karen didn't like the shade of blue. Even quiet Mr. Lowe, who had told Devin after a few beers that Karen fined him over illegal holiday lights. If Karen thought everyone was afraid of her, Devin knew differently. They weren't loyal. They were just tired of fighting. Maybe all they needed was someone stubborn enough to take the first swing. The second step was research. Devin drove into town and spent hours at the county clerk's office, combing through records. He found the original deed with his name stamped clear as day. Then he looked at the correction filed under Brandon's name. The language was vague, riddled with jargon. It mentioned a clerical oversight without any supporting documentation. Devin pointed this out to Sean, the clerk. "Yeah, I noticed that too," Sean admitted quietly. "Usually corrections like this require a court order, or at least signatures from all parties. This one's unusual." "Unusual?" Devin asked. "Or illegal?" Sean shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I can't say that, but I can tell you it's not standard procedure." Devin left the office with copies of everything, his folder now thicker than ever. He knew a good lawyer could tear it apart, but lawyers meant money, and money was tight. Still, if it came down to choosing between going broke or losing the cabin, he knew which way he'd lean. The third step was patience. Devin forced himself to play the long game. He kept showing up on weekends, refusing to vanish the way Karen wanted him to. Sometimes he sat by the water, casting a fishing line just to prove he was still there. Other times, he parked across the road, notebook in hand, jotting down license plates of every car that came and went from his stolen porch. One Saturday, Brandon swaggered out, annoyed. "You seriously just gonna sit there all day? You look pathetic, man." Devin didn't look up from his notepad. "Pathetic as living in a house your mom stole for you." Brandon's smirk faltered for half a second before he masked it with a laugh. "Keep talking. We'll see how fast the sheriff shows up when I say you threatened me." Devin snapped the notebook shut and finally met his eyes. "Funny thing about threats. They're a lot easier to disprove when everything's documented." The remark caught Brandon off guard. For once, he didn't have a quick comeback. He just sneered and walked back inside, slamming the door. That tiny crack, seeing Brandon unsettled, was fuel for Devin. It meant the plan was working. They weren't expecting patience. They weren't expecting discipline. They were expecting rage. But behind Devin's calm eyes, the storm was building. Because while he documented, photographed, and researched, he was also sketching something new on the back pages of his notebook. A drawing of a tall wooden fence. Not just any fence, one that cut across the main access road, the road every board member used to get to the HOA office by the lake. If the Whitfields wanted to treat his cabin like theirs, then he'd treat their office like his property line. The fence was more than lumber and nails. It was a line in the sand. A message carved into wood. "You can push me, but you can't erase me." But Devin knew once that fence went up, the fight would no longer be quiet. It would be loud, public, and impossible for the HOA to control. Devin's plan took shape on a grey Saturday morning. The lake was quiet, fog rolling low across the water, the kind of weather that usually meant neighbors stayed in. Perfect for him. In the back of his truck, he had lumber stacked high, concrete mix in buckets, and a coil of heavy-duty chain. It didn't look like much to anyone passing by, but Devin knew exactly what it would become. He parked at the edge of the main access road, the one every HOA board member, including Karen, used to reach their head office by the water. It wasn't technically private, but a sliver of the land running along it belonged to him. Devin knew his boundaries. He'd studied them enough. He was about to make sure the HOA couldn't ignore those lines any longer. As he unloaded the lumber, his neighbor Mrs. Green shuffled over, clutching a cardigan against the wind. "What are you doing out here with all that wood?" she asked, her voice curious but wary. Devin gave a small smile. "Building a reminder." "Reminder of what?" "That this is my land," he said, hammering a stake into the dirt. "And they don't get to erase me." She blinked, watching him work, and then nodded silently before heading back home. She didn't need to ask more. Everyone knew about the feud. They just wanted to see if Devin had the backbone to stand against Karen's machine. By midday, the framework of the fence was rising. Tall, sturdy beams sunk deep into concrete, lined in a way that would make it impossible to drive through without serious damage to a car. Devin's arms ached, sweat soaked his shirt, but each swing of the hammer fueled him. He could almost hear Karen's voice in his head, lecturing about bylaws and community harmony, and each nail he drove in felt like a rebuttal. It wasn't long before Brandon showed up. He pulled up in his shiny black SUV, music thumping, and jumped out, hands on his hips. "What the hell is this?" Devin didn't pause. "It's called a fence. My property, my right. You can't block this road," Brandon barked. "The HOA uses this every day." "That's the point," Devin replied calmly, raising another beam into place. "They want to pretend my land doesn't matter, so I'll make sure they can't ignore it." Brandon's face flushed red. "Mom's gonna bury you for this. You're finished." Devin set down his hammer and looked him dead in the eye. "You've been saying that for weeks, Brandon, but every day I'm still here. Maybe I'm not the one who's finished." Before Brandon could spit back, 2 more neighbors wandered over, drawn by the noise. Then another. Soon a small crowd was gathering, residents clutching coffee mugs, kids tugging at their sleeves, all of them curious about the sight of Devin raising a wall against the people who had ruled the neighborhood for over a decade. One man in the crowd muttered, "About time someone stood up to them." Another whispered, "He's gonna get crushed. HOA lawyers don't play." But Devin kept working. By late afternoon, the fence stood tall, a solid barrier stretching across the road. At its center, he nailed a large plywood sheet and stapled a copy of his deed onto it. The words were bold, impossible to miss. Owner, Devin Matthews. Beneath it, he spray-painted in thick black letters, "This is my land." When Karen finally arrived, her Mercedes stopped short, tires skidding on the gravel. She stepped out slowly, fury radiating from every movement. Her sunglasses came off, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the crowd, then the fence, then Devin standing there with dirt-streaked arms and a hammer still in hand. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "Protecting what's mine," Devin answered. "This is obstruction. It's vandalism. It's legal." Devin cut her off, pointing to the deed stapled to the fence. "Check the boundaries. This strip of land belongs to me. Always has. You wanted to erase me on paper, so I figured I'd remind everyone with wood and nails." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others whispering nervously. Karen's lips pressed into a hard line, her son pacing beside her like an angry dog straining at the leash. But she couldn't order the fence down, not without drawing more attention to the very documents she'd twisted to steal the cabin. The standoff stretched long and tense, broken only when a local reporter, tipped off by a neighbor, pulled up with a camera crew. Microphone in hand, she approached Devin first. "Sir, can you tell us what's happening here?" Devin straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "The HOA president stole my cabin through false paperwork, so I built this to show I'm not going anywhere. They want to bury me in silence. Well, now the whole town knows." The camera panned to Karen, who stammered through a polished line about community standards and safety concerns. But the words rang hollow. Everyone could see the deed pinned to the fence. Everyone could see the raw determination in Devin's eyes. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control of the narrative. But while the fence drew the community's attention, it also drew battle lines, and the Whitfields weren't about to let their grip on power slip without a fight. By Monday morning, the fence wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a landmark. Cars slowed as they passed, people snapped photos on their phones, and whispers spread through town like wildfire. At the diner in Pell City, where most locals grabbed breakfast before work, conversations circled back to the same question. "Did you see what Devin built?" Some admired him. "Took guts to stand up to Karen," one man said between sips of coffee. "Been waiting years for somebody to call her out." Others shook their heads. "He's asking for trouble. HOA's got lawyers, money, connections. He can't win this fight." But no matter which side people leaned toward, everyone was talking. And that alone was a shift. For years, Karen had ruled with little resistance. People grumbled in private, sure, but when it came to taking a stand, they kept quiet. Now, thanks to Devin, silence was no longer an option. At the lake, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. Devin noticed more faces peering from porches, more cars parked on the roadside, more people out for walks that seemed suspiciously timed to watch the spectacle. The fence had turned his personal battle into a public showdown. Late that afternoon, a group of neighbors approached while Devin was reinforcing the base of the structure. Mrs. Green was there, joined by the Harris family and Mr. Lowe. They stood awkwardly for a moment until Mrs. Green cleared her throat. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," she said gently. "Wasn't trying to stir anything," Devin replied, hammering in another nail. "Just trying to show them they can't push me out." Mr. Harris, a tall man with a deep voice, stepped forward. "You're not wrong. Karen pulled the same stunt with us 3 years back. Said our deck violated code. Cost us 10 grand to rebuild it the way she wanted. Truth is, she didn't like that it blocked her view of the lake. We didn't fight. Figured it wasn't worth the headache." Devin looked up, sweat dripping from his forehead. "And did that stop her from messing with you later?" The couple exchanged a look. Mrs. Harris sighed. "No. She fined us again the next year for parking our boat trailer too close to the curb. That's exactly why I'm not rolling over," Devin said firmly. "If you give people like her an inch, they'll take the whole lake." The words seemed to land heavier than he expected. Mr. Lowe nodded slowly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time somebody didn't just pay the fine and move on." The conversation was interrupted by the crunch of gravel. Karen's Mercedes rolled to a stop, Brandon trailing behind in his SUV. They stepped out, all business. Karen addressed the small crowd as if she were at a press conference. "Everyone, I understand emotions are high right now, but let's not forget, this fence is illegal. Devin Matthews is obstructing community property, and the board will be taking immediate action." Her voice carried with practiced authority, but the reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of nods, she was met with silence. Then a voice from the back called out, "Community property. That road cuts right through his land. Everyone knows it." Karen froze for half a beat before smoothing her expression. "Technicalities don't change the fact that this is disruptive." "Disruptive to who?" Mrs. Harris shot back. "To you and Brandon? Or to the rest of us who've been dealing with your double standards for years?" The crowd shifted, murmurs rising, people emboldened by the challenge. Karen's jaw tightened, her composure cracking for the first time. Brandon stepped forward, trying to salvage the moment. "Y'all don't get it," he sneered. "My mom runs this place. You think you can just flip on her after all she's done? You wouldn't have a community without her." But his words only made the murmurs grow louder. One man muttered, "Community's been worse because of her." The tension broke when a local news van pulled up, camera crew piling out. Reporters asked questions rapid fire. "Mr. Matthews, how long do you plan to keep this fence up? Mrs. Whitfield, are you facing legal complaints about the property transfer? Brandon, do you live here legally or not?" Karen plastered on a smile for the cameras, but Devin could see the cracks beneath. She wasn't used to defending herself publicly. She was used to controlling the narrative behind closed doors. As microphones swung his way, Devin kept his answer simple. "All I want is what I worked for. My land, my cabin, my peace. They tried to erase me with paperwork, so I showed everyone the truth in wood and nails. That's it." The words echoed, simple and raw, and for the first time, Devin noticed people in the crowd clapping. Just a handful, but it spread, hesitant at first, then stronger. Karen's face flushed red. She tugged Brandon toward the car, whispering fiercely. Cameras followed, capturing every step. For once, she wasn't the one setting the tone. That night, Devin sat by the fence with a lantern, exhaustion sinking into his bones. Neighbors passed by, some offering quiet words of encouragement. The tide was turning. Not fully, not yet, but enough for him to feel the shift. But Karen wasn't about to lose gracefully. She was regrouping, and Devin knew the next move she made would be bigger, louder, and far more dangerous. By midweek, the tension had grown too heavy for the lake community to ignore. The fence wasn't just blocking the HOA's main access road, it was blocking Karen's control. And Karen Whitfield wasn't the type to sit quietly while her authority crumbled. On Wednesday morning, Devin arrived to find 2 sheriff's cruisers parked near the fence. Karen stood beside them, perfectly dressed as always, speaking to the deputies in a tone dripping with confidence. Brandon leaned against his SUV, arms crossed, smirking like victory was already his. Devin's chest tightened, but he forced himself to breathe slow. He walked toward the fence, folder of documents tucked under his arm. "There he is," Karen announced to the deputies. "The man obstructing community property. I want him removed immediately." One deputy, a broad-shouldered man with a mustache, held up his hand. "Mr. Matthews, is this your land?" Devin opened the folder, pulling out the deed and county maps he'd copied. "Yes, sir, right here. This strip of road cuts through my property. The fence is built within my boundary lines, legal and documented." The deputy studied the papers carefully, then compared them to the county's system on his tablet. Karen's eyes narrowed as silence stretched. Finally, the deputy looked up. "He's right. This is his land." Karen's voice pitched higher. "That road is vital to community access. The association's office depends on it." "Ma'am," the deputy replied calmly. "That may be true, but legally, this land belongs to Mr. Matthews. He's within his rights to put up a fence." The crowd that had gathered, neighbors, curious onlookers, even another news crew, buzzed with whispers. Brandon shoved off the SUV, his voice sharp. "So you're just gonna let him block us? This is harassment!" Devin stepped forward, his voice steady. "Harassment is breaking into my cabin, changing my locks, and boxing up my belongings. This fence? It's the only thing keeping me from being erased by your lies." The crowd stirred, and cameras caught every word. The deputy sighed, clearly tired of the drama. "This looks like a civil matter, not criminal. If either of you want it changed, you'll need to take it to court." Karen's composure cracked. "Court? This man is making a mockery of me." Devin's lips curled into the faintest smile. "No, Karen. You did that yourself." The deputies left, refusing to intervene further. Karen turned on her heel, fuming, dragging Brandon with her. The cameras followed them, and the footage aired that night across local stations. The headline blared, "Homeowner builds fence against HOA president. Sparks community battle." By Thursday, Devin's phone was blowing up. Strangers tracked him down online, offering encouragement, sharing their own HOA horror stories. He hadn't asked for attention, but it found him anyway. The story spread beyond Pell City, picked up by regional outlets hungry for drama. That evening, Karen stormed into an emergency HOA meeting at the community center. Devin wasn't invited, but neighbors filled him in later. She demanded a unanimous vote to fine Devin thousands of dollars for unauthorized construction and creating hostility in the neighborhood. But the vote didn't go her way. For the first time in 12 years, board members hesitated. Some abstained. One, Mr. Harris, outright refused, saying, "This isn't about bylaws. This is about you using your position to steal." When Devin heard that, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just his fight anymore. People were beginning to see through Karen's facade. 2 days later, a letter arrived in Devin's mailbox. Official HOA stationery, signed by Karen. It demanded he remove the fence within 72 hours or face escalating fines and potential litigation. Devin held the letter in his hands, shaking his head. Instead of tearing it up, he pinned it right next to the deed on the fence for everyone to see. Beneath it, he spray-painted 2 words in bold red letters. "Try me." That weekend, the standoff escalated. Protesters gathered, some supporting Devin, waving handmade signs that read, "Property rights matter," others backing Karen, insisting rules kept the community safe. Local TV vans parked along the roadside, recording every second. Tension boiled over when Brandon, furious, tried to rip the letter down. Devin stepped forward, blocking him. The two men stood inches apart, fists clenched. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the first punch. But Devin refused to swing. Instead, he raised his voice so everyone could hear. This isn't about anger. This is about fairness. About not letting someone with power take what doesn't belong to them. If they can do it to me, they can do it to any of you. The words rang out like a challenge, echoing across the water. Neighbors exchanged glances, and one by one, heads began to nod. Even those who'd stayed silent before were starting to feel the weight of his fight. Brandon cursed under his breath and stormed off. Karen followed, her face pale, her control slipping through her fingers like sand. But Devin knew this was the tipping point. The next move wouldn't be bluster or fines. The HOA would take him to court. And that's where the real battle would begin. It didn't take long for Karen to make her next move. 2 weeks after the sheriff refused to tear down the fence, Devin received an official court summons. The HOA, represented by a well-known Birmingham law firm, was suing him for obstruction of community access and violating association bylaws. The papers were thick, the language heavy, designed to scare him into folding. Devin sat at his kitchen table in the cabin he refused to abandon, the papers spread out before him. His sister Denise was on speakerphone, her voice firm. Don't let them scare you, Dev. They're bluffing half of it. You've got the deed. You've got the proof. Fight them. Lawyers cost money, he muttered, rubbing his temples. Then scrape it together, sell some equipment, take extra jobs. I'll help where I can. You've fought for everything else in your life. Why stop now? Her words lit a fire in him. Devin wasn't a stranger to uphill battles. He called a local attorney, Rachel McBride, who had a reputation for standing up to crooked officials. When he laid out the documents, his deed, the so-called correction signed by Karen, photos of the boxed-up belongings, she leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. This isn't just sloppy, Rachel said. This is fraud. No way a correction like this should have gone through without your signature. She used her position to push it through fast. If we bring this in front of a judge, we've got a real case. The court date was set. Word spread fast, and by the time Devin walked into the courthouse in Talladega, a crowd had gathered outside. Neighbors, reporters, even strangers holding signs that read, "Stand with Devin." He wasn't used to attention, but the support gave him strength. Inside, the atmosphere was thick. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored suit, Brandon beside her, smirking as if victory was guaranteed. Her lawyers shuffled stacks of papers, polished and prepared. Devin sat with Rachel, his folder of documents neatly organized, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. When the judge entered and the case began, Karen's lawyers launched into their performance. They painted Devin as disruptive, combative, and hostile to community order. They spoke of rules designed to maintain harmony and an owner unwilling to comply. Karen nodded along, her face a mask of self-righteous concern. Then it was Rachel's turn. She rose, calm but sharp, and laid the documents before the judge. Your Honor, this is the original deed showing my client's rightful ownership. And this, she said, holding up the correction Karen had filed, is the so-called fix. No court approval, no second signature, no supporting evidence. Just a stamp pushed through under the authority of an HOA president abusing her power. This isn't compliance, it's theft. The courtroom shifted. Even reporters scribbled faster. Devin was called to the stand. He spoke plainly, telling his story the same way he would over a cup of coffee. How he'd worked decades to save. How he found the cabin, bought it with cash, and poured his sweat into fixing it up. How he returned to find his locks changed, his belongings shoved aside, and another man drinking from his daughter's mug. I'm not asking for special treatment, Devin said, his voice steady. I'm asking for what's mine. I've got the papers, I've got the proof, and I won't let anyone, No matter how powerful, take it away. When Karen took the stand, her calm cracked under cross-examination. Rachel pressed her on the correction filing. Who authorized this change? Karen stammered. The county office processed it. With only your signature. Yes, but no further verification? No consent from the rightful owner? Karen's face flushed. It was a clerical mistake, and I corrected it. Or exploited it. Rachel shot back. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. By the time closing arguments ended, the tide was clear. The judge ruled in Devin's favor, declaring the correction invalid and restoring the deed fully in his name. Karen's attempt to fine him for the fence was dismissed outright. Worse for her, the judge suggested the county investigate how the correction was approved in the first place. When the gavel fell, Devin exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. The courtroom erupted, some clapping, others shaking his hand as he walked out. Reporters swarmed, asking how he felt. Devin kept it simple. I'm just glad the truth came out. I wasn't about to let anyone steal what I worked for. Outside, neighbors crowded around. Mrs. Green hugged him. The Harrises thanked him for standing up where they hadn't. Even Mr. Lowe, normally quiet, told him, "You gave the rest of us courage." Back at the lake, the fence still stood, the deed stapled proudly to its center. But now it wasn't just wood and nails. It was a symbol. A reminder that sometimes you had to build your own line to stop people from crossing it. That night, Devin sat on the porch of his cabin, finally at peace. The mug his daughter had made sat safely in his hands, warm with fresh coffee. He stared out at the water, the reflection of the moon stretching across it, and whispered, "We did it." The fight had been ugly, exhausting, and unfair, but it had also revealed something important. When you refuse to be erased, when you fight for what's right, even the strongest walls of corruption can crack. And that was the lesson Devin wanted everyone to remember, that standing up for yourself isn't just about protecting what you own. It's about protecting your dignity. So if you ever find yourself cornered, remember this story. Remember Devin's fence. And remember that silence only feeds the people who think they can take whatever they want. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes the most ordinary people end up fighting the battles that matter most.